Eric, you are a great friend of Ukraine, a great friend of this conference. Um, you did a virtual appearance right after the full scale Russian invasion in 2022. Then in 2023, you and I came here together, and I wanted you to reflect on what did what when you went after that to the battle lines themselves, and you have recently been on the battle lines because you have been very active in various ways. But what we can say is you know a lot about what the battle looks like. So give us your sense of in these last 2 years that you've been so involved, how has the battle changed and where is it now?
So Fareed, I want to thank you and the Yes Conference for getting me interested in Ukraine. I love the country and I love the people. And to say that the courage of the Ukrainians is strong is understating what I have seen. I began a little bit more than 2 years ago working with a number of the Ukrainian companies and the Ukrainian governments. I saw, for example, my very good friend Minister Kamishin on stage. And I spent a fair amount of time traveling around the country, about 25,000 kilometers of trains, for example. The battle has started with relatively straightforward back and forth, but because Ukraine did not have a navy or nor an air force, Ukraine had to act fairly quickly. So you saw the beginnings of an indigenous drone industry because that's what they could build. And those drones were relatively simple but powerful. They also built very powerful sea drones, which, as you know, cleared out the Black Sea in the first year that I was involved with, which was an amazing achievement. But the lessons that I've been watching are that the war it's not like what you see in movies. First, the war is much, much worse than you've ever seen when you're actually in the front. And I know that the courageous people on stage know that. And the second thing is that the iteration cycle against their enemy is very, very fast. So if you look, for example, the various tactics, a simple example is that Russia had the World War II manual of large assaults with essentially tanks and so forth. The Ukrainians invented a tactic involving rifle teams. It was copied within about 3 months by the Russians. Similarly, the Russians innovated by building fiber optic FPV drones. As you know, those are not detectable by normal electronic warfare. And as a result, the Ukrainians copied that, and now both sides have them. Those drones go about 25 kilometers, 30 kilometers with a long fiber optic cable. I thought that the Russians would be relatively easily stopped because of the superior technology of the Ukrainians. But in the last 18 months, Russia has put enormous amount of money into building scaling systems. And as the people in the room know, the most terrorizing thing that they're doing are Shahed 136s, which they got out of essentially Iran and have now perfected. And those Shaheds are getting faster. And the interceptors that the Ukrainians use are also getting smarter. And so it's a cat and dog or cat and mouse game, if you will, but with deadly consequences. If you look at the war today, Ukraine is holding the land really well against an enemy that is 3 times more people, roughly. And the Russians have shown what my very good friend, your good friend, Dr. Kissinger, said is true, which is the Russians are willing to endure an enormous amount of pain to achieve their objectives. And unfortunately, that's what's happening now.
And when you look at the situation technologically, what do you think the next 6 months or year of war will look like? Is it going to be 3 million drones on each side, kind of battling each other, or how do you think it's going to, what's the future going to look like?
Well, as a technologist and not as a military expert, I had assumed that we could use technology to fight the war without a lot of human death. And that was my optimistic view, and I was wrong. So unfortunately, since this is a land war and land wars are about occupation, we're going to continue to see horrible deaths on both sides. And I want to acknowledge the deaths on their sides as well. And in that fight, the key element will be who accumulates more mass to push. So if you look at the Russian operations, where they have been successful at enormous cost to them and very slowly, with great resistance from Ukraine, it's because they massed 10, 20, 30,000 Russian soldiers on a particular point. At the moment, these battles are around Pokrovsk and in that area, Avdiivka and so forth. They're currently trying to go up toward Kramatorsk. Now, I've been to these towns, and they're very, very nice towns. And the problem with the war is it's destroying these cities. And when the war is over, which it will end, the rebuilding of those towns by Ukraine will be very, very difficult and expensive, which is very saddening, along with the human life. But I think a reasonable prediction is that this is a war where the infantry will still be in the woods, that the distance between the people and the weapons will increase. In other words, both sides will push people back, right? Because the range of the drones are getting farther. An example would be that in my last visit, I won't say the locations, but they didn't really want me to get closer than about 50 kilometers to the actual front because the Russian drones are now far enough. And I can tell you that Ukraine has very strong assets, not just on the front, but also in sort of what they call the mid-range, where it's roughly up to 100 kilometers, where an awful lot of Russian infrastructure is. So the strategy goes something like this. Each side continues to harm each other's infrastructure. There's enormous carnage on the actual war, but now both sides are using small teams, motorcycle teams, rifle teams, and so forth. You're seeing a lot of FPV drones. And the one that has more mass, that is more pressure, more power, is likely to be able to push through. The good news for Ukraine, and I want to be very clear here, is that Ukraine wins with intelligence. They have incredible monitoring systems. Again, I won't go into the details here. They know exactly where everything is. They know how to plot to hold the Russians and to push them back. They have very, very good data analytics, as we say in my industry. And they're just smarter. They're moving quicker, right? And I'm very optimistic that we can hold the line and eventually push them back in that context.
Talk a little bit about kind of what is the cutting edge of the technology now, because so much of it seems to have become, can you identify where the enemy drone is and how it's going to fly, what its path is? And as you said, the Russians are now using essentially drones with very thin wires on them, and the wires extend tens and tens, maybe hundreds of kilometers. Talk about that, and how do you then jam that? Because they're not using GPS, they're using essentially a landline.
So this is an example of innovation in war that I don't think anyone really anticipated. When I started working with Ukrainians, the big problem was getting through the Russian electronic warfare jamming systems. And the Ukrainians, of course, built their own. It appears to me that both sides are learning how to get through the jamming. Now, why is jamming important? Because if you can't see, you can't attack. The systems, the drone systems, are not automated enough to be able to press the button and have it go find the target and hit it on its own. The targets are camouflaged, they're moving, and so forth and so on. If you look, all of the initial US weapons that were sent in were broken by the Russians because they couldn't get through the Russian jamming, GPS, geolocation issues. Both sides appear to have figured out a way to defeat that. That's a big deal, right? In the case of the Russians, they're using the FPV drones with fiber that you're describing. And I won't describe how the Ukrainians have done it, except that they've done a very good job. So it looks to me like the various walls that were set up along the line, the electronic walls and so forth, are being defeated. And that tells you that there will be more throw weight, more mass, more swarming. So the next year looks to me like more and more collective action, swarms, collective action where you have one drone, two drone. I remember this is a year ago, talking to one of the young commanders. And I said, tell me what it's like. And he said, well, remember that most of our drones don't get through, so we send 10. And I said, well, and the drones are not expensive. And I said, well, would you do better if you had 20? He said, yeah. In other words, from their perspective, if they can send a large number and they can have coordinated action, which they can do while they're in flight, you get an aggregation of mass. So the way to understand it is that as the war progresses, there'll be more and more drones. Minister Kamishin, as I was listening earlier, was talking about the scale of the drone commitment and the scale of the drone industry in Ukraine is phenomenal. And again, I can tell you that Ukraine is on a war footing. Russia's on a war footing. The Russian strategy seems to be more humans and more big things. And the Ukraine strategy seems to be more humans and more little and very smart things. In my industry, intelligence always wins. And that's why I'm so optimistic.
So there are a lot of European officials here, people, defense officials. What do people in Europe need to understand? What is it that Ukraine needs the most, in your view, to win this war?
Well, I am really pleased that the Europeans are increasing their military budgets. I think, and I agree with the U.S. leadership, that it's good for Europe to have its own defense forces, and not just depend on the U.S. And that's a point of tension. But the Europeans have pledged to increase their military budgets well above 2%, which I really welcome. Here's the problem. The Europeans are doing exactly the same thing that the Americans are doing. They're doing more tanks. Now, by the way, there are no tanks on this battlefield. It's a land war with no tanks. Do you know why? Because the drones kill the tanks within about 30 seconds. The general rule on the front is that if you see a drone, you're dead in 2 to 3 minutes. So why in the world would you build more tanks? And tanks, by the way, are big and expensive, but you don't need them anymore. What you need is more automated air defense systems. I can tell you that the easiest way for Ukraine to hold and eventually repel Russia is to have an integrated air defense system that does not allow the air war, which is what precedes the assaults, to continue. The way the Russians' tactics work, basically the Russians come in and they, if you will, soften or damage the Ukrainians, and then they surprise them on foot. Right? The fact that the Russian drones can get through is something to address. This is not solved by tanks and artillery and those sorts of things. The future war is going to be drone on drone. The Ukrainian leadership understands this. They're very, very intelligent. They told me this many, many times. And so there's a whole indigenous industry in Ukraine of drones and then anti-drones. And as was discussed earlier, when the war is over, that will be a huge industry, export industry for Ukraine, which will be a source of great pride.
And finally, Eric, there are, of course, lots of Ukrainians here from all walks of life, but especially from government. Do you have any final thoughts for them? What do you want? What do you need from them so that you can keep helping the Ukrainians?
Well, as I said earlier, the courage of these people, for those of you who've not been in the front, the courage, I cannot describe how frightening the situation is, because the drones, once they get a hold of you, they don't give up. You're trapped. And so what we need from Ukraine is more of what they're already doing, which is obviously the incredible courage. We also need stronger and stronger, softer people, more and more investment in the education of their very young, very talented people, especially the math and physics people. Ukraine has a long, long history of technical excellence. Those people are going to be needed to build both the attack networks, but also, once there's a ceasefire, the defensive networks. In all scenarios, right, wars end with some kind of stop, and then there's a period of tension. During that period of tension, Ukraine will still have to invest in her defensive systems. Those defensive systems will be a combination of intelligence, communications, and mass. And there's no question Ukraine is organized to do that. All the ministers that I've spoken with in Ukraine have told me this is not going to happen again.
Eric, I want to thank you. I was talking to somebody in Special Forces this morning, and I mentioned your name, and she said, "Oh, we all know about Eric Schmidt, and we are hoping that he will save us." So you've become something of a legend.
You're very kind. The partnership with Ukraine is one of the great joys of my life. Thank you all.
And I'll just close out the session by telling you one thing. Eric mentioned that we all believe the Russians can take enormous pain, and we all use that World War II analogy of the Russians losing 25 million people. Please remember, 10 million of those people were Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians can also take pain.